March 27, 1945, Kiel Canal, Germany. The duty officer's hands were still trembling. The ink on the ship's log had barely dried. If the Gestapo discovered these notes, he could be tried for defeatist thoughts. But he had to write down what he had just witnessed. Ships were vanishing, not from bombs we could see, nor torpedoes we could track, but from something invisible beneath our own waters. Through the observation post window, he had just seen the impossible. 3 cargo vessels sank within 12 minutes.
No planes o overhead, no periscopes, no torpedo wax.
Only sudden, violent explosions that tore steel hulls apart and sent thousands of tons of precious coal and grain to the seabed. In the last 72 hours, the Kiel Canal, Germany's vital artery linking the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, had become a graveyard for merchant ships. That night, 102 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers visited the canal, but they carried no incendiaries. Led personally by Brigadier General John Davis of the 313th Bomb Wing, they carried something far more insidious: 12,000 naval mines. Equipped with magnetic, acoustic, and pressure fuses, these devices would turn Germany's own coastal waters into its deadliest enemy. What German naval observers could not grasp, and what the entire High Command would fail to understand for weeks, was that this night marked the beginning of Operation Starvation, the most devastating yet least known campaign of the European War. Germany's defeat would not be written only in the flames above Berlin, but in the silent destruction of ships carrying the coal, food, and raw materials that sustained 70 million civilians. The crisis had begun in January 1945, though its roots lay earlier. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had long advocated aerial mining operations, and his idea was now applied to Europe. The U.S. Army Air Forces realized a harsh truth once resisted. Germany imported vast quantities of oil, grain, and metal. To strangle it with mines was far more efficient than to bomb its cities. One of those who understood this was Lieutenant Colonel Alice Johnson, a former Carnegie scientist temporarily assigned to the Air Forces. In January 1945, she submitted her calculations to Major General Curtis LeMay. For every 21 mines dropped, one would find a target, a far higher rate than submarine-laid mines, which needed 12 for one hit. But a B-29 could scatter thousands in a single night, beyond the reach of any submarine. According to post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interrogations, the German Navy had 349 minesweepers and 20,000 trained men, under the command of Captain Otto Tamura, one of Germany's best mine warfare specialists. But they had prepared for the wrong war. Their magnetic sweepers could only reach 10 meters above the seabed. Their acoustic countermeasures were crude noisemakers, and against pressure-sensitive mines, which detected a ship's passage by water displacement, they had no defense at all. The first true shock came on March 27, 1945. Radar operators at the Kiel Naval Base watched in disbelief as B-29 bombers flew low and precise over the canal, dropping their loads into exact coordinates. By dawn, 18 ships had failed to emerge from the narrow waterway. The next 2 weeks brought the second phase of maritime disaster. According to the U.S. Naval Institute, the destroyer Zerstorer Schneeberg, which had survived every major battle of the war, was now trapped in port, its captain unwilling to risk the minefields. The Americans had dropped invisible, undetectable death. German minesweepers worked from dawn to dusk, but each night more ships vanished. The mines seemed to think. Some exploded immediately, others waited days, learning the rhythm of traffic. The mining missions were flown by unescorted B-29s at medium altitudes, guided by radar. Flying alone or in small groups, they were harder to track than the massive daylight bomber formations. At 5,000 to 8,000 feet, they flew low enough for precision, yet high enough to evade most flak. Post-war technical reports stunned German engineers. American mines employed 6 different types of sensors: magnetic coils to detect steel hulls, acoustic devices that heard engines, and pressure triggers that sensed ships passing overhead. Some combined all three and waited days before arming. On April 2, 1945, in Hamburg Harbor, the 6,000-ton freighter Weserland entered a route cleared that very morning. Her draft was well within safe limits. At 8:32 a.m., a pressure mine, dropped 6 days earlier, and programmed to ignore the first 3 ships, detonated beneath the engine room. Of 53 crewmen, only 12 survived. The ship sank in 4 minutes, the surface covered with oil, debris, and drowning men. Hamburg's shipping volume collapsed by 85%, from 320,000 tons in March to barely 44,000 in July. Once Germany's busiest harbor, it became a maritime ghost town. Ships lay idle at anchor, captains refusing to risk the journey. Food rotted on docks while cities starved. By mid-April, U.S. naval analysis showed that within the first month, 113 German merchant ships had been sunk by mines, 9% of the remaining fleet. A canal that once carried 70,000 tons of cargo daily had slowed to a trickle. All across the Reich, the effects spread. Decrypted German communications revealed reports like, "The factory in Essen has no coal today. The ships from Bremen cannot pass." Food shortages worsened. The 1945 grain harvest was the poorest since 1910, and the blockade prevented imports. Daily rations in major cities fell from 350 grams of rice equivalent to just 250, soon replaced by turnips and sawdust-laced flour. Even fishing boats, once ignored by the military, became victims. The naval log records that the 30-ton Fischgluck triggered an acoustic mine in the Bay of Lübeck, killing 7 fishermen. Its diesel engine produced the same frequency as a destroyer's. Even wooden vessels were unsafe. Magnetic mines could sense their metal engines and fittings. Captured German reports later submitted to Allied headquarters calculated that, at the current loss rate, Germany would have no merchant fleet by November 1945. "We are not being defeated," one report concluded. "We are being starved." Before the mining began in March 1945, Germany shipped 545,000 tons of cargo through its main ports. By April, it was 381,000. In May, 209,000. By June, barely 98,000. Every ton lost meant less food for civilians, less coal for factories, less oil for the army. At the Ruhr steelworks, once the industrial heart of the Reich, production fell by 85%, not from bombing but from the lack of coal and iron ore. The furnaces that had forged tanks and warships now stood cold and silent. Workers were dismissed to search for food. According to the German Ministry of Health medical records, poverty diseases unseen since the Kaiserreich began to spread. Beriberi from vitamin deficiencies, tuberculosis among the weakened, children with swollen bellies from ascites while their bodies wasted away. The Kriegsmarine attempted desperate countermeasures. Post-war testimony says they sent explosive boats to detonate mines. Wooden-hulled vessels were requisitioned for service. Channels declared cleared would claim new victims just hours later. Captain Otto Tamura's list of ships sunk by mines, submarines and aircraft in the Pacific, now transposed to the European theater, noted 349 vessels and 20,000 personnel engaged in minesweeping. By May 1945, the nature of the threat had broken the morale of German merchant crews. Lieutenant Colonel Tadao Kuwahara, a German naval officer in the record, later told Allied investigators that near the end it became difficult to find sailors willing to sign on. The rate of desertion and ship abandonment was severe. According to shipping control records, dozens of merchant captains refused to sail, preferring prison to a suicide run. The psychological effect wasn't limited to seamen. In coastal cities, residents watched ships explode in waters that should have been safe. The randomness and the invisible enemy produced a unique terror. By June 1945, the German industrial economy had effectively stopped. Kawasaki shipyards, once building U-boats and destroyers, went 2 months without steel. Mitsubishi Aircraft Works, which had been producing new fighters, shut for lack of aluminum. Even the sister ship of the Pride battleship, the unfinished carrier Graf Zeppelin, rusted in dock. No fuel to move her, no steel to finish her. Coal, Germany's principal energy source, became desperately scarce. Through the Kiel Canal, daily cargo fell from 70,000 tons in March to 35,000 in April, plunged to 7,500 in May, 1,750 in June, briefly rose to 8,000 in July, then fell again. Power plants shut. Whole administrative districts lost electricity. Factories in Essen that once ran 3 shifts now operated only when a delivery of coal arrived, sometimes once a week, often not at all. Railway ministry records show locomotives burning furniture, books, even temple gates to stay running. Without coal from the east, trains stopped within weeks. The mining campaign's effect on food distribution was catastrophic. Germany had relied on maritime transport to move grain from agricultural regions to the cities. With coastal shipping paralyzed, millions faced hunger. City ration logs show people queuing for 14 hours for rice-equivalent distributions that never came. The grain existed in Odessa, barely 200 kilometers away, but no ship would risk the mine sea. Estimates predicted that by the end of winter 1946 up to 10 million could starve. Only surrender and subsequent Allied food aid prevented the disaster. By July 1945, civilian calorie intake averaged 1,200 calories per day, down from 2,200 before the war. Fishing villages that once fed themselves found their boats destroyed or trapped in port. Naval records state the 500-ton trawler Ozean struck a mine 3 miles off Bremen while trawling for the city. 23 fishermen died. Germany's conquered granary in the east, Ukraine, and its ports, Odessa, Sevastopol, Rostov, became unreachable. They were systematically mined. Vessels that for decades shuttled between the Reich and the East now rusted in harbor. Intercepted German communications recount the 8,000-ton freighter Ostland attempting to sail from Odessa in June 1945 with typhoid medicines for Berlin and a cargo of grain for Essen. A magnetic mine tore off her stern. 43 crew died, and 5,000 tons of grain sank in minutes. Where there were once 50 ships a day, now only 3 or 4 wooden coasters moved. Troops stationed in the occupied East found themselves isolated and began requisitioning food from civilians there, producing famine in those regions too. The industrial lifelines from the East, iron or coal oilseeds, withered. Port throughput at Danzig and Odessa collapsed. Where 1 year earlier hundreds of thousands of tons moved, by July 1945 only a few tens of thousands were recorded. Post-war logistical reports from the occupying forces showed stockpiles of steel, coal and food in the East worthless because ships no longer came. Those that tried to return never did. The consequences cascaded through the wartime economy. Aircraft production that relied on Eastern aluminum fell by over 90%. Tank production ceased. Even basic ammunition became scarce as lead and copper from the East were cut off. American mines represented a technical edge the Reich could not match. 1,000 and 2,000-pound variants with diverse fusing systems, improved magnetic M9 and M11 types, acoustic A3 mines triggered by propeller noise, A5 devices keyed to hull sounds, and pressure-sensitive A6 mines. German engineers inspecting recovered mines concluded the technology was years beyond their capabilities. Magnetic sensors could distinguish ship types. Acoustic devices ignored countermeasures. Pressure sensors were sensitive enough to detect small craft. The technology infuriated German minesweepers. A single mine might ignore 5 passing ships and then destroy the 6th. Routes declared safe became death traps. Some mines armed only days after deployment. Others waited weeks. That randomness made every voyage a roulette. B-29 radar navigation allowed precise mine laying in darkness and bad weather. Intercepted communications showed German observers baffled by how accurately mines were placed at night and in cloud. The technical advantage extended to mine assembly. In less than 6 months, a single assembling station staffed by a dozen officers and 171 enlisted men loaded 13,090 mines onto superfortresses, producing roughly 200 fusing and delay combinations. Each minefield was tailored to counter German countermeasures, staying steps ahead of sweep technology. Germany's submarine fleet, its last offensive naval capability, found itself imprisoned in home waters. Records show U-58, which in other circumstances might have been a prowling threat, trapped in Kiel for months because commanders would not risk the minefields. Vice Admiral Takagi T. Transposed name, commanding the 6th Fleet reported that submarines could not deploy. The Americans have turned our own seas into prisons. When the last battleship sortie attempted to sail in April, a desperate mission toward the Northern Islands, it had to use the long coastal route rather than the cleared canal, exposing it to Allied reconnaissance and carrier aircraft. Mines indirectly claimed the life of the Reich's largest capital ship. Minesweeping units, once confident, gradually realized their impotence. Magnetic sweeps reached only 10 meters above the seabed. Acoustic countermeasures were simple noisemakers useless against precise American sensors. On May 15th, minesweeper WT-12 detonated a mine while sweeping. 18 sailors died despite all prescribed countermeasures being in place. Magnetic cables deployed, noisemakers operating, safe speed maintained. The mine had been set to ignore standard sweep signals and to hunt the ship itself. Captain Tamura later admitted this in post-war interrogation. The results of the B-29 mining campaign were devastatingly effective. They ultimately starved the nation. It was a far-sighted policy, one report later summarized. The gains from Operation Starvation exceeded pre-war estimates. The 20th Air Force flew 1,529 sorties. In 46 separate missions, they laid 12,135 mines across 26 minefields. Mine-laying missions accounted for only 5.7% of XXI Bomber Command's successful sorties and cost the Americans just 15 B-29s. In return, the mines sank or damaged 670 vessels, totaling over 1.25 million tons. More than losses from submarines, carrier aircraft, and surface ships combined during the same period. The efficiency was staggering. For every B-29 lost, Germany lost roughly 45 ships. By contrast, the submarine force, despite famous successes, required 190 boats to sink 1,314 ships during the whole war, an average of 6.92 ships per submarine. The 40 B-29s assigned specifically to mine-laying averaged 7.08 ships destroyed per bomber in just 5 months. Behind the statistics lay immense human tragedy. Post-war German Maritime Union records list over 25,000 merchant seamen killed. The most experienced sailors, some with decades at sea, lost without replacement. By war's end, many surviving ships were crewed by teenagers or by elderly men with no seafaring experience. Families faced a particular kind of grief. Unlike honorable battlefield deaths, mine victims disappeared at sea. Notifications to next of kin read only "lost at sea while carrying grain." No glory. By July 1945, German cities were dying. Berlin's population, swollen by bomb refugees, consumed the last rice and grain reserves. Black market prices for grain rose to 100 times the official rate. In Hamburg, people exchanged heirlooms for potatoes. Hospitals operated without anesthetic. Pharmaceutical factories lacked raw materials. Penicillin could not be shipped in. There were no bandages, no medicines. Patients died of infections that could have been cured. School lunch programs, once providing at least one reliable meal, stopped in May 1945. Teachers reported students fainting from hunger. Some schools closed entirely. No food, no coal for heating, no transport. The mine-laying campaign triggered cascading economic failures. Factories without coal could not produce. Without wages, workers could not buy food. Without food, they could not work. The shipyard that had built the Bismarck-class vessels once employed 30,000 workers in January 1945. By July, only 3,000 remained. The rest had been laid off or fled to the countryside to find food. Those who stayed produced nothing. No steel, no coal, only survival. Even breweries shut. A centuries-old Munich brewer closed in June 1945 for lack of brewing rice in bottles. Transport and distribution had failed. The army found its preparations for an anticipated Allied invasion undermined. Ammunition and fuel could not be moved between islands and coastal defenses. A private file of Army Minister Iraqi, transposed name in capture documents, later recorded, "We planned to fight on the beaches, but our soldiers had no rounds. We promised to fight to the last man, but that man would be armed with bamboo spears." Divisions being transferred from occupied eastern territories to defend the homeland found their plans collapsing as ships would not risk sailing. Elite forces stationed in the east sat idle. The home front prepared to meet invasion with raw recruits. By early July 1945, of 143 German ships sunk by bombs, torpedoes, and mines, less than 10% were due to submarines, and under 10% to air attack. Over 90% of full 129 ships were the result of mines. B-29 mine-laying achieved what submarines could not: the near-total paralysis of Germany's merchant marine. Area bombing required hundreds of B-29s dropping thousands of tons of explosives to destroy urban districts. A few dozen B-29s spreading 100 tons of mines could paralyze a port for months. Mine-laying in eastern ports produced an additional humanitarian crisis. Forced laborers from occupied regions could not return home. Colonial settlers could not evacuate. Both populations faced starvation as food distribution collapsed. The mined harbor of Primorsk, transposed, remained uncleared until 1950, according to U.S. Navy records, and was remined during the Korean War. Some American mines from 1945 continued to claim ships 5 years later. By late July, August 1945, Germany faced near-total collapse. Strategic bombing survey analysis of shipping records showed that traffic through vital straits had fallen to a tiny fraction of peacetime levels. The empire that had launched its war dreams could no longer feed even its capital. On August 5, 5 days before surrender, B-29s laid another 95 mines in German waters. These mines continued to kill after hostilities ended. German logs record the freighter Neptun striking a mine on August 20th, 5 days after surrender, killing 18 crew who had believed the war was over. Historians debate the role of the atomic bombs in ending the war, but the effect of the mining campaign is unmistakable. Prince Kono-style witnesses later testified that aerial mining was as effective as the bombing of industry. In the final phase, essential foodstuffs and critical materials simply could not reach the homeland. In the recorded surrender speech, the head of state spoke of an inability to continue. Behind that inability were empty stomachs and cold, idle factories and shipyards, all consequences of mines. Post-war, Admiral Nomura-style testimony admitted, "We could have endured bombing. Cities can be rebuilt, but we could not endure starvation. Mines defeated the nation by taking away its ability to feed itself. Surrender did not end the tragedy." The U.S. Navy informed German authorities that clearing mines was Germany's responsibility. Under American supervision, German minesweepers began the deadly and technically demanding work of clearing their own waters. Many mines had delayed fuses that would not arm for months. Others used ship-targeting mechanisms that might not trigger until the 100th vessel passed. Some combined multiple sensors and required precise conditions to detonate. The Americans provided approximate locations but not exact positions or types. In December 1945, the minesweeping force under Captain Tamura, transposed, was transferred to a newly formed civil authority to continue clearance. Many of the crews were former naval enlisted men now working for their defeated state and the occupiers. The human cost continued. Coast Guard records show that between August 1945 and December 1946, German minesweepers lost 81 ships and 423 men clearing U.S. mines. The economic impact lasted for years. Insurance records show that, despite official declarations, ships avoided certain areas. Premiums for German vessels remained high through 1950. Some remote channels were not fully cleared until the 1970s, when modern technology finally made it safe. The expertise gained clearing American mines proved useful in 1950 during the Korean War. Many of the same German minesweepers and crews were quietly sent to Korean waters to support clearance operations, forming special units under former Navy officers. Several German sweepers disappeared in Korean waters. Their losses were kept secret for decades. Because the post-war constitution barred overt military action, their deaths were recorded as maritime accidents. The Hunger Campaign fundamentally changed naval warfare. The use of aircraft navigation systems to place mines precisely at chosen coordinates became a standard combat principle. Acoustic, magnetic, and pressure mines joined the world's naval arsenals. The ship-targeting mechanisms first used in the Hunger Campaign became common features of modern naval mines. Delayed activation devices and combined sensors appeared in minefields stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea. Though devastatingly effective, Operation Hunger remained largely unknown to the American public. There were no dramatic aerial shots, no famous ace pilots, and no visible explosions to film. Mines that sank ships at night could not provide the spectacle that daylight bombing raids did. The B-29 and Lancaster crews who laid the mines received almost no public recognition. Those who bombed cities became celebrated heroes. Those who starved an empire remained anonymous. According to Allied veteran records, mining missions didn't even qualify for the same combat honors as bombing runs. Yet the Allied Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that Germany had faced two kinds of destruction. First through strangled imports and second through direct bombardment. The most astonishing finding was this: even without the Normandy landings, even without the atomic bomb project, even without Soviet advances in the East, Germany would have collapsed. Captured wartime assessments revealed that by mid-1944, Germany had diverted nearly all remaining shipping to carry food and coal from occupied ports, abandoning industrial raw materials entirely. It was a silent choice that guaranteed economic death. The scale of Operation Hunger can be measured through its cold numbers. A total of 1,529 sorties were flown, planting 12,135 naval mines, weighing over 9,100 tons in 26 minefields. 46 separate missions, only 5.7% of all Allied bombing operations. 15 bombers were lost to enemy action. 103 airmen died, a loss rate of just 0.98%, far lower than the 3.6% suffered by conventional raids. German shipping losses tell the real story. 484 ships sunk, 186 damaged, for a total of 670 affected vessels. Over 1.25 million tons of cargo destroyed, 63% of Germany's surviving merchant fleet. Traffic through the Kiel Canal dropped 98%. Hamburg's port activity fell by 85%, and 35 of 47 major harbors were forced to close. 35 of 47 convoy routes were abandoned. Imports shrank by 90%, coal transport by 95%, food distribution by 88%, industrial output by 65%. The human cost followed. Over 25,000 German merchant sailors and 7,000 fishermen perished. Another 423 died in post-war mine clearance. 10 million civilians faced starvation, a catastrophe only avoided by surrender. Clearing the main harbors took 2 years. Clearing all waters took 27 years. Over 6,500 mines were defused. More than 5,000 remain unaccounted for to this day. 81 German minesweepers were lost during post-war clearing operations. Operation Hunger became the most successful aerial mining campaign in history. In just 5 months, fewer than 200 bombers achieved what submarines and surface fleets could not: the total paralysis of German maritime trade. The campaign proved that wars can be won not only by destroying armies, but by destroying the means to sustain them. The Germans did not grasp the full scale of their disaster until long after. Naval headquarters blamed Allied submarines. Civilian officials accused British bombers. Even Germany's leading mine warfare expert, Captain Tammer, did not realize until interrogation that Allied bombers had planted over 12,000 mines. Ultimately, Germany was not defeated primarily by invasion or by atomic power, but by its own waters turned against it. Those bombers that dropped mines instead of explosives may have killed more Germans through hunger and collapse than all the famous fire raids combined. Operation Hunger remains obscure because its victims died quietly, unseen, unfilmed. Mines had no glorious battles, no dogfights, no heroes in headlines. Only a maritime nation, starved in silence, strangled by precision. Yet it was precisely this invisibility that made it powerful. Those 670 lost ships carried away Germany's ability to wage war, to feed its people, to function as a nation. Every mine that detonated in the dark sent ripples through German society. Empty stomachs, cold homes, idle factories, and finally surrender. Captain Tammer's post-war testimony stands as the campaign's gravestone. He admitted that the mining effort had starved the nation. Through invisible weapons, it achieved what bombs could not: the complete paralysis of an empire. It was a campaign that changed the course of the war, yet few have heard of it. Proved that war can be won in many ways, and that the most effective victories are often the quietest. Those crews who flew through the night, dropping mines into black waters, may be forgotten by history, but their actions changed it. They destroyed no cities, killed no civilians, yet by cutting a nation's lifeline, by grounding ships, silencing factories, and starving an army, they won a war. It was an unseen victory, but a total one. When we recall the Second World War, we remember Normandy, Stalingrad, the Ardennes, and Hiroshima. But we should also remember those who mined the seas in darkness, the scientists who designed the weapons, the analysts who drew the minefields, and those who won through mathematics and patience, not fire and fury. Operation Hunger stands as a reminder. The loudest weapons are not always the deadliest, and the most visible victories are not always the most decisive. History is often written by those who worked in shadow. That is the truth of war and the lesson of peace. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the war's most enduring threat did not vanish with the signing of surrender. Across the North Sea, the Baltic, and the Rhine estuaries, more than 12,000 mines still waited beneath the gray waters, silent, patient, and deadly. They had been laid with mathematical precision by air crews who had long since returned home. Now, their legacy belonged to the defeated. The ruined ports of Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel became graveyards of steel and mud. Rusting hulls jutted from the shallows like tombstones. Cranes stood frozen in salt air. In the warehouses, there was no cargo, no sound of engines, only the echo of boots and the slow shuffle of men with ropes and charts. Germany's new army, the Raumkommandos, mine clearance crews formed from sailors, fishermen, and prisoners. Their work began before the rubble of cities was cleared, before power was restored, before bread was reliable again. For them, the war had simply changed shape. Between 1945 and 1950, more than 1 million tons of wreckage were removed from German harbors. Thousands of unexploded mines were located, mapped, and neutralized, many using crude wooden boats with magnetic cables hanging beneath them, a dangerous improvisation that cost lives daily. The average clearance diver did not survive a full year. The government could not pay them much, only a ration card and a promise of extra bread if they lived until winter. By 1947, official estimates recorded 81 German minesweepers lost to explosions during post-war operations. The sea, once Germany's trade artery, had become its grave and punishment. Fishermen, desperate to work again, often risked venturing into uncleared zones. Entire villages along the coast depended on whether a single trawler would return. Sometimes it didn't. Local newspapers reported them simply as missing. No ceremonies, no memorials, only widows waiting by the docks. The Allied administrators overseeing reconstruction faced an invisible blockade. Without clear harbors, ships from Britain, France, and America could not bring food or machinery. Relief vessels waited weeks outside minefields for safe passage. An ironic reversal had taken place. The same weapons that once starved Britain's enemy now threatened to starve the survivors of that enemy as well. Mine clearance was not an act of mercy. It was a necessity for Europe's recovery. The economic effect of Operation Hunger lingered long after the shooting ended. The Reich's merchant fleet was gone, its coal shipments crippled, its inland waterways clogged. Factories stood intact but useless, with no raw materials to feed them. Entire industries, shipbuilding, metal, textiles, collapsed under the combined weight of defeat and paralysis. In the winter of 1946, German cities endured what became known as Die Hungerjahr, the Hunger Years. In Hamburg, bread rations fell to 700 calories a day. In Berlin, residents tore wood from bombed buildings to cook thin soups of nettles and barley. American observers described the scene as a nation that had died standing. And yet, beneath the ruins, a new generation began to learn what their country had done and what had been done to it. In secret post-war analyses, both British and American strategists studied Operation Hunger's results carefully. The conclusion was sobering. The campaign had been more cost-effective than any strategic bombing in the European theater. While the raids on Dresden and Hamburg destroyed morale and infrastructure, the mining campaign had destroyed function. It had cut arteries, not just wounded flesh. A senior RAF officer later wrote, "It was the most silent but most complete act of economic warfare ever conceived." But moral questions followed. Could starvation, however indirect, be considered a legitimate weapon? Many Allied officers refused to discuss it. They preferred to remember the valor of open battle, not the slow death of blockade. In academic circles, debates flared. Was it better to bomb a city or to let it collapse unseen from within? Neither offered comfort. Both left graves. For the German people, memory of the mines fused with memory of the war itself. Children born after 1945 grew up hearing the muffled thunder of detonations from the sea, controlled explosions from clearance teams. Reminders that the war was not yet over, only quieter. Fishermen crossing the Baltic in the 1950s still marked invisible lines on their maps. Do not anchor here. Even by the early 1970s, ships occasionally vanished along the Danish coast. Every discovery of a rusted mine brought back the ghosts of that hunger campaign, its efficiency measured in absence, its silence in fear. The psychological effect was just as deep. Operation Hunger had proven that an empire could be defeated not by invasion, but by deprivation. For European thinkers in the post-war decades, it became a metaphor for modern conflict. That control of supply lines, of trade, energy, food, could bring down nations without firing a single shot. It reshaped the very philosophy of Cold War strategy, where economists became as vital as generals. The lessons of those dark waters reached far beyond 1945. In 1952, Captain Tammer, the same naval officer who once oversaw German mine warfare, was invited to testify before a British historical commission. He spoke softly, his voice translated for the record. "The mines did not kill our soldiers. They killed our nation's breath. The sea itself betrayed us, and we had taught it how." His words were never printed in German newspapers. The New Republic preferred stories of reconstruction, not confession. But among historians and engineers, his statement endured like an epitaph, a reminder that silence can be more devastating than fire. By the time the last known mine was cleared from the Kiel Channel in 1972, a generation had come and gone. Sailors who had once laid the mines were grandfathers now, and the young men who died defusing them had no graves but the sea. In a ceremony attended by British, German, and American officers, a wreath was dropped into the water. Not in victory, but remembrance. No speeches followed. Only the slow drift of flowers across calm gray waves. Operation Hunger had ended decades before, but its echo remained in every shipping lane, every economics textbook, every policy of deterrence that came after. It had shown that modern warfare no longer required the roar of artillery, only the patient suffocation of supply. It had also shown that victory, when achieved through starvation, was never clean, never free of shadow. And so, in the long history of the Second World War, amid the noise of battles and the fire of cities, there exists this other story, quiet, technical, almost invisible. The story of how a nation was defeated by mathematics, by logistics, by hunger, and by the cold intelligence of men who understood that a war can be won by stopping motion itself. In the aftermath of the Second World War, as Europe rebuilt from ashes, a quiet revolution took place not in factories or parliaments, but in war colleges and policy rooms. The lessons of Operation Hunger, its precision, its economy, its unseen lethality, became a new scripture for strategists who sought to control the next conflict before it began. No longer was victory measured in cities burned or divisions destroyed. It was measured in lines of supply, in the ability to keep food, fuel, and information flowing while denying it to the enemy. The concept of total blockade, once executed with mines and bombers, evolved into something broader: economic encirclement, trade sanctions, energy control, currency warfare. The same mathematics that had mapped minefields now mapped global markets. In 1949, when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, Its architects, men who had studied the results of Operation Hunger in military archives, spoke less about battlefields and more about logistics. NATO's first war games did not imagine tank assaults across Germany. They simulated the closing of shipping lanes, the interruption of rail lines, the paralysis of ports. The lesson was simple and chilling. A nation cut off from its lifelines will collapse without a single soldier crossing its border. Within the Soviet Union, these studies were read as warnings. The Red Navy poured vast resources into mine warfare and countermeasures, believing that the next European war would begin not with invasion but with the sealing of the seas. Submarines became the new mines, mobile, invisible instruments of economic strangulation. The Cold War's silent standoff at sea was born from the memory of that earlier, quieter campaign. By the 1960s, the strategy of hunger had transcended the ocean. The West learned to wage blockades not only with weapons but with wheat, oil, and trade. A denied shipment could now do what a mine once did: bring an economy to its knees. Energy crises replaced naval sieges. Embargoes replaced bombardment. Historians would later call it the economics of deterrence. But its moral roots remained tangled in the same ethical dilemma. How far can a nation go to starve another into submission without becoming monstrous itself? Decades later, as the Cold War ended, files once marked top secret were declassified. In them, military analysts described Operation Hunger not merely as a campaign, but as a transformation in the understanding of power. It taught us, one report read, that the destruction of an army is temporary, but the destruction of a nation's ability to eat, to trade, to breathe, that is total war. Today, few remember the names of the pilots who flew those missions. Their photographs remain in black and white archives. Young men in leather jackets, smiling beside aircraft that carried no bombs, only mines. Their victory was invisible, their weapon mechanical and cold, yet it reshaped how nations think, how wars are fought, how peace is kept. Standing on the docks of Hamburg or Kiel now, one sees nothing of that past. Container ships glide over the same waters once haunted by death. The sea looks clean, calm, almost innocent, but beneath it lies a history of hunger, of silence, of a war that continued long after the guns had stopped. For history remembers the loud, the battles, the explosions, the speeches, but the true architects of modern warfare were the ones who learned to win without sound. Their legacy endures not in ruins, but in restraint. And in that restraint lies the final lesson of Operation Hunger, that the deadliest victories are not those seen in fire, but those achieved when the world grows quiet.